So hi everyone, my name's Kristen Fletcher. I'm the Programs and Engagement Manager here at the Haley Public Library. Tonight our presentation is Gardening for Soil Care with Manon Gaudreau and Amy Mattias from the 5B Resilience Gardens organization. Love to introduce these ladies to you. This is the third of a three-part series on creating resilient gardens, and it's been a delight to work with both of them. And I just want to give a shout out to the truly excellent presentations that they have been giving for this series. They're informative, they're informal, and just anyway, you'll see for yourself as time goes on. So I'd like to introduce Manon Gaudreau. Manon started gardening in 2005 when her daughter asked her a question, but Manon did not know the answer. She's been looking for answers and sharing them with her community ever since. After studying seed saving with Ketchum seedsman extraordinaire Bill McDorman, Manon became a master gardener and helped establish Valley Victory Gardens. She has taught classes locally over many years and is the co-director of the Wood River Seed Library. Manon co-manages the 5B Resilience Garden Collaborative. Amy Mattias, our other presenter, is program director for the Sun Valley Institute for Resilience, and in that role launched the 5B Resilience Gardens Collaborative last spring. She serves on the Blaine County Food Council and is a board member of the Idaho Center for Sustainable Agriculture. She is also the co-director of the Wood River Seed Library. Amy follows regenerative practices rooted in traditional ecological knowledge in her own garden and is currently enrolled in a permaculture design course. She has worked within the local food movement for 10 years and is committed to sharing her knowledge of and passion for growing food with the community. And just a reminder that the Haley Public Library is home to one of the Wood River Seed Libraries, so anytime Monday through Friday, 10 to 6, and on Saturdays, noon to 5, you're welcome to come in and shop at the Seed Library and see if there are any seeds that you would like to plant for this year. So with that, a warm virtual welcome to Manon and Amy. And thank you both very much again for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Kristen. That was a nice introduction. Very flattering. And there's another opportunity to get seeds and plants. This weekend, we have a seed and plant exchange on Saturday from 10 to 12, and we'll talk more about it at the end of this presentation.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. Oh, not that one. Not this one. There we go. All right. Is that full size? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us today. As Kristen mentioned, we're here to chat about garden soil care. And you heard a little brief introduction to us, which I always appreciate Kristen giving. One caveat that I should have added to mine is I did graduate my permaculture design course. I was in the middle of it for the other two, but I am officially graduated and I'm a permaculture design certificate holder. Any updates to yours, Manon?
Yeah, I just finished a teacher training with Bill McDorman and the Rocky Mountain Seed Alliance for teaching seed saving. And that was so interesting, and meeting people from all over the world, people from all cultures who have so much passion and so much spirit. You know, they're really connected to the spirit of life, the spirit of seeds. It was amazing.
Lovely. All right. So we wanted to share first and foremost a little bit about 5B Resilience Gardens. So as Kristen mentioned in her introduction, this was something that Manon and I, along with a few other collaborators, Emma is on the line. She was one of our original collaborators as well, really realized with when COVID first hit us is that people were interested in gardening. Some people had more time on their hands and wanted to find a new hobby. Some people were concerned about food security going forward. So they really wanted to find a way way to boost their own skill set. And gardening and baking, I think, were two things that a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon with. And we are so happy to have you all on this gardening bandwagon because it's a fun place to be. We get to be scientists in our own backyard, and we get to share this with our community, which is one of my favorite things about being a gardener. Is it sets you up to be an educator with your community and learn from your community members. So that's what 5B Resilience Gardens is really all about. So you can see a list of other collaborators that are part of it, along with a lot of community members that have joined the cause in the last year and a half or so. So we have a few guiding principles that we like to talk about. So Kristen gave us an opportunity to do a series where we focus on each gardening principle or guiding principle for 5B Resilience Gardens throughout the spring. So you can see the ones on food production and pollinator habitat on the Haley Public Library website. And tonight we are talking about soil care. And just like a few caveats on what is a 5B Resilience Garden. It's any type of edible crop production, whether you have a pot of herbs on a windowsill or you have a multi-acre food production garden in Haley or Bellevue or the South Valley like I am. The one thing to think about is that this is not for commercial use. So we have a lot of amazing small farmers in our region that sell their products. 5B Resilience Garden is all about sharing, growing food for yourself, sharing it with your neighbors and with your communities. Little to no chemical use, which we'll talk about tonight, is really important to us as it creates a healthy habitat for ourselves, for our neighbors, and for the ecosystem around us. 5B Resilience Gardens may incorporate native plantings, but it's definitely not a requirement. You could grow all annual vegetables. If you would be a resilience garden, you might grow all culturally appropriate native edible food, and you're still a resilience gardener. And the last little thing to consider about that is water-wise techniques, because we live in a high desert. So being mindful with our water use is really important. So we incorporated that into our way of looking at gardening through 5B Resilience Gardens. In our conversation today, we are going to talk about garden soil care. So this is just kind of an agenda of what we'll talk about, so you know what to look forward to. We'll talk about what is soil fertility and how to boost your soil fertility, how to prolong your soil fertility, and how to support that diversity of your soil microbiome. We'll talk about armoring the soil, which is a term used in regenerative agriculture, and that's really about reducing bare ground. So you do that through mulching, cover cropping, techniques like that. We'll talk about minimal soil disturbance, which is really reducing the amount of disturbance that you put on your soil. So that can be chemical inputs, that can be digging up and tilling every season, and we'll talk about why that's important. And then we'll talk about some smart water use. So ways that we can be more thoughtful about our water and more efficient in the use of water, because we probably have to water our garden, especially in a drought year. So how can we do that in a thoughtful approach? So, soil, what is it? It's alive. Soil is a living, breathing entity, and it should be tended and treated and stewarded as one. One of my favorite quotes is, soil gets thirsty, hot, and feverish. So how can we reduce the likelihood of your soil being thirsty, hot, hungry, or feverish? And the tips that we'll talk about today address those things. So we're not going to get in heavily into the soil science because that's a whole other presentation, but we wanted to give you all a general overview of what soil was, or what soil is. So soil is made up by a lot of different pieces and parts: air, water, minerals, living organisms, dead organisms, decaying matter, decomposed matter, things that wiggle all around and make a lot of holes in the soil, things that poop in the soil to add nutrients to it, rocks. There's a lot of things that make up soil. And we have 2 more slides about the soil composition that we'll show, but I just wanted to take a moment and point out this map. This is a map of Haley. You can find this on Blaine County GIS. There's an awesome mapping of our whole county, and there's one layer that's soiled. So I just wanted to show these are all, each color is a different soil type in Haley proper. So there's a lot of soil. I think there's hundreds of soil types within Blaine County alone. So we're not going to go into different soil types. We're going to talk more generally about how do you manage the soil type that you have and how do you build fertility in it. But if you really are interested, there are some tools available to us in this community where you can find out the exact soil on your land. I just bought a home in Gannett, and half of my yard is prime farmland soil. The other half is hydric soil. You wouldn't know that because it's been managed as a conventional lawn for about 30 years now. But as I start to rebuild soil health, I think we're going to start to see a difference in the way that that soil functions with the plants that we grow on it. So that's a fun thing if you're really interested in knowing the exact type of soil you have on your own property.
I would add one thing that generally speaking, the soil in our high desert is more alkaline, and there's a lot of clay. We have a lot of clayish soils. So there are differences. There are micro soil regions as shown on the map. But generally speaking, we have to be aware that we have, in many cases, too much alkalinity, and we need a more acidic soil to grow our vegetables.
So Manon, I'll let you talk us through what's going on in this photo or this image.
So soil is alive. It's full of life. And so many people think of dirt as, a commodity, something you can buy in a bag and something that's dead, right? But a fertile soil is not dead at all. It's something with a lot of life in it, including microorganisms, bugs, small bugs that you can't see with your eyes, and bigger ones like worms and other bugs that you can see. And all of them bring life to the soil. And soil took thousands and thousands of years to get built. If you look at the little diagram on the left, it shows you the different layers of soil. So on top you have humus, and humus is really the life that grows on top of the soil that has decayed, and it's some kind of a compost that is very decomposed and has stabilized. That's what we call humus. And then below the humus is the topsoil. And below the topsoil is more the mineral soil. So, things with sand. And the deeper you go in the soil, the less oxygen there is, and the more compact it is. And in some of our regions, we hit the bedrock, and we don't have a whole lot of subsoil. And so if the bedrock is higher, then the drainage doesn't happen as well. And the topsoil we have here, because we're in a high desert, the topsoil is very thin. Naturally speaking, there's little vegetation around us other than what man is planting. There's very little. I'm looking at the mountains here. There's little vegetation on the mountain. Therefore, there's little humus, and the topsoil is very thin. So it makes it even more precious. It makes it even more important to take care of it, to make sure that we maintain the fertility of that soil. We have to help it, and we'll talk to you about how we do that.
And then let's talk a little bit about organic matter. And just, I know Manon has a slight accent, so I've always pronounced it humus, where hummus in my mind is spelled with a double M, just throwing it out there for people who are like, hummus, I thought it was humus. We say things a little differently, just to clarify that for anyone who's out there wondering. I've never seen chickpea dip on my soil.
Okay. Did you want to start talking about the organic matter?
Sure. I mean, I think you and I both have a lot to say about organic matter. So humus is a type of organic matter. Compost is a type of organic matter. And in nature, Organic matter ranges usually between 2 and 6% or so, but as we deplete our soil, we lose organic matter in it. And that's what reduces the fertility of the soil, because the more dead and decomposing materials we have in the soil, the more food we have for our plants, because plants eat decomposing or decomposed matter. So organic matter is really what leads to that fertility. It's what leads to nice texture of soil. It's what allows soil to infiltrate water, to buffer temperature. So the less soil organic matter we have, the closer we are to effectively dirt. And when we get to the point that we have less than 1% organic matter is when you really start to see problems with topsoil runoff, with compaction, with soil that cannot hold the life of plants. Anything to add, Manon?
Yeah, well, one thing we want to keep in mind is that we have to keep feeding that soil biology. And the way to feed the soil biology is to keep adding more organic matter. The more organic matter, the better. It increases the life in the soil. And I talked about, buying bags of soil. If you buy, for example, I bought something called raised bed soil. It's soilless. It's a soilless soil. And when we buy something in a bag, all the ingredients, maybe 95% of the ingredients in the bag are organic things, but they've been processed, they've been overheated, they've been dehydrated, so they're not as heavy when they carry them. How much life is left in that bag when you buy it? You have to think about that. When you use that potting soil, you have to think about feeding the biology and letting the organism and all the population of little and big organisms grow in that soil, and that takes time. So when we first establish our soil, we might buy soil from a company, hopefully from a local company here, and they provide good products. But once you've established your soil, think about building the soil health from year to year. Some people have asked me in the past, should I buy new soil every year? No, don't buy new soil every year. Build your soil. Add organic matter to your soil. The more you disturb your soil, the less healthy it is.
And that's what we're going to get into now that we've talked about soil and how it's a living, breathing entity. And there's a lot of things that go into making up soil. The rest of our presentation is primarily focused on how you can maintain or build that soil fertility. And those are through techniques that are part of our practices that we use within our gardening. So there's a lot of words on this slide. Most of them are just explaining what healthy soil is or is not. But nutrients are present in soils. A lot of the time it's rocks that are broken down that have minerals in them. It's old residues from plants. It's old poop and dead bugs that are decaying. And those make up the fertility of the soil that's naturally there. And then a lot of us gardeners want to boost that fertility. So we get really, really tasty tomatoes or really yummy, yummy fresh fruit off of our trees or really lush, dark green leafy plants. So a lot of the times we're adding in fertility, we're adding in nutrients, we're adding in food, however you want to phrase it. So there's so much to say here, and I don't want to just read these word for word, but I think overall, you can see in these photos kind of the difference between healthy, rich, fertile soil on the top in the hands. Dark soil is usually very, very healthy, where the lighter soil, like Manon shared, like that's more of the subsoil that's got more sand in it, more rocks in it, might be very dry and brittle. When the rains come, none of that water is going to get infiltrated down into the soil. It's going to just run off and take whatever nutrients are available away with it. So healthy soil is porous. There's a term called tilth that maybe some of you are familiar with, and that has to do with like the texture of soil. So soil, I've heard people describe healthy soil as like black cottage cheese. You want what are called soil aggregates, and those are the pieces of soil that stick together. And those, while they look like they're very compacted, it's actually more air in there, and there's pockets, and there's a lot of surface area. So the microbes live in the surface area. The water can infiltrate in all those little places. Oxygen is in there because soil has to breathe as well. So we really want to look at the soil tilth and look at porous soil. So healthy soil is not compacted. And that's something that we address through tillage, right? Tillage tends to compact soil. You might have heard of the term hard pan. That's when a couple inches below the soil surface, it's really hard and compact. So if you grow root vegetables and 3 inches down, they go sideways, that's usually a sign that you have compacted soil, and there are ways to break that up. Healthy soil is a buffer, so it regulates temperature and water. And a lot of people kind of struggle with what that actually means, but if your soil is healthy, it doesn't get too hot or too cold. It stays in that happy medium area during the growing season. If you have a lot of rain, healthy soil will infiltrate it and hold on to it, but not too much where it gets waterlogged and swampy. So healthy soil is dynamic, and it does a lot of the hard work for us when it's healthy. Jump in, Manon, and add a lot of stuff to that.
Yeah. So you might ask, how do I decompact the soil? Well, we use a fork, and we kind of fluff up the soil if we have to. But first we have to not walk on the garden soil. If you have a garden bed, you don't want to walk on it, and you don't want your animals to walk on it. You want to keep it as light and full of air as possible. So avoid pressing it down by any means.
Especially when it's wet. Like when it's in the springtime and that snow is melting, try to avoid walking on your soil, because when it's wet, it will compact, and then you'll get a really hard pan. And then you'll probably want to till it so you can work with it later in the season.
So when we design a garden, we have aisles where we walk, and we have areas, garden beds, where we never step into. So it has to be at arm's reach, right, to get in it. Or you can have stepping stones in the garden where you only put your foot on the stepping stone, but never on the soil itself, even when there's nothing growing in your garden.
So I think we should, go to the next slide, because I know we have a slide all about minimal disturbance that talks about that tillage principle. But first we wanted to talk a little bit about armoring the soil surface. This term really comes from agriculture. It's one of the 5 principles of regenerative agriculture. So when we say armoring the soil surface, it's a fancy way of saying reduce or eliminate bare ground. Like we've said a ton of times already, soil is a living, breathing thing. The sun heats it up, the wind blows it away. So when we armor that soil surface, we can prevent erosion, we can help cool the soil down when it's too hot, and we can give plants kind of a healthier microclimate to thrive in. So there's 2 main techniques used to armor the soil surface, and one is mulch, and I think that's pretty well known to a lot of gardeners in our region. I know I see a lot of gardens that have really lovely wood chip mulch or straw mulch laid about, and that's a really nice way to reduce bare ground. That creates habitats, it can hold moisture, it can cool the soil. My personal preferred technique is cover cropping, because cover cropping is a way of armoring the soil surface, but you're also providing a lot of food for the microorganisms. Because, for example, in this photo, this is a daikon radish. That is one of the cover crops that's actually used to break up compacted soil. So they can be 2 feet long and really, really big, and they will break up compacted soil and put oxygen into that soil. And then a lot of people who cover crop do what's called chop and drop. So you would chop off the top of it, effectively killing the plant, but all those roots that are in the soil, they die off. And that's what feeds the microorganisms, because microorganisms eat sugar. When roots die off, it's called exudates, and that's the sugar that feeds the microbiome of the soil, which is really fun. So you're getting a lot of bang for your buck when you do something like cover cropping. The fun thing about cover cropping for us home gardeners is a lot of the plants are edible, like kale is a cover crop. Radishes are a cover crop, daikon radishes, turnips, all sorts of brassicas are cover crops, which is really exciting. So when I started talking to farmers about cover cropping and they're telling me all the stuff they're growing, like peas are a cover crop, beans are a cover crop. And I'm like, well, you guys just grow this and you chop it down and you don't even eat it? And they're like, eat it? Why would we eat that? I'm like, well, because it's tasty. I mean, that's what we grow in our gardens. So I think cover cropping can also be looked at a way to grow. Usually you're growing a couple different varieties of cover crops in one plot, but you could grow a whole row of daikon radish to help break up compacted soil, and you could eat half of it and then let the other half die out in the ground to help feed the microbes. Grasses are another cover crop that's used pretty often. Grasses do a really nice job of feeding the soil because when you grow grass, the roots are effectively growing the same distance deep as the grass grows tall. And when you cut it back, it sheds all those roots and that feeds the soil microbiome. It also creates all that porosity that we talked about with soil tilth. So I really love cover cropping, as I'm sure you realize by my long-winded explanation of what it was. But Manon, talk to us about what kind of armoring the soil surface you do in your garden.
Yeah, I use I use organic matter like wood chips, or like on the photo below, just dead plant material. And dead plant material could be weeds I'm pulling. Instead of putting the weeds in the trash, the weeds go on top as some kind of a mulch. And in the fall, when you harvest a crop, it doesn't have to be in the fall. Sometimes it's much earlier than that. When you're harvesting something and you're removing the stems or the leaves that you're not eating, like a tomato plant, or what can I think of?
Broccoli or brassicas are a good one because you're harvesting that head or that big part, and then all the extra leaves, just throw them on your soil.
And also I have a lot of perennial plants like sorrel and comfrey. And comfrey is very prolific. It grows and grows. So as I cut it back through the season, I throw it back onto the garden as a mulch. And the advantage of using organic mulch, whether it's wood or wood chips or plant material, is that they decompose and they compost in place and they nourish the soil. They add to your fertility. So the cover crop adds fertility also through its roots. The roots decompose and adds to create dead material that decay and create more organic matter in your soil. But mulching on top also does some of that. There's also plastic mulch, or I use a lot of burlap instead of plastic mulch that you can put at times on top of the soil to prevent evaporation. But obviously these two materials don't contribute to adding fertility to the soil, but at least they prevent evaporation. They prevent your soil from drying out. So that's a good thing to do. Oh, and also if you grow high density, if you grow a bed with high density, it could be a raised bed, or if you apply high density growing, you don't need mulch, obviously, because just the plant material itself of what you're growing becomes the mulch until you actually harvest that. And once you harvest it, then you want to cover it. And typically in the fall, when I harvest things in the fall, I throw back all the cuttings from my shrubs and all the dead leaves from my trees. I pile them up on top of my garden. And the branches help to hold these leaves in place. So I use what I have as a mulch rather than buying things. and except, a roll of burlap that I buy once in a while, but I reuse them. I think that the next slide shows a use of all these mulches. So this is the Grange garden on the photo here, the Grange community garden. And we've prepared 3 mounds to plant squashes. And then there's one linear bed, and then there's a kind of a square bed behind that. And so we put our soil about 8-inch deep or a little more on those areas. And then I put burlap on top of the square and the rectangular mounds, and I think some on the circular mounds too. And then we ran out of burlap, so we started pulling all the weeds that were around, and we have plenty of that around. We have alfalfa and prickly lettuce and salsify and dandelions that haven't gone to seed to flower yet. So all of these have been added, and so you can see all the green material that's around the round mounds and around the rectangular ones. We used weeds as a mulch. So we use what we have, and then we use rocks around them to mark our bed areas with a log on top of the burlap to prevent the burlap from blowing in the wind. And then all of the areas that are not beds is covered with wood chips.
This picture is a great picture, displaying the different techniques all layered on top of each other and how you can work with what you have available, and you just figure out a way to make it work. And if you don't have enough burlap to cover everything, you get creative and you use the weeds, right? But I think maybe it'd be helpful to kind of back it up. And I'd love to share a story since my parents aren't on this call, so I get to throw them under the bus a little bit. But I grew up with parents who gardened, and they started every spring by renting a gas-powered rototiller and turning up the soil in a big square plot. And in my mind, that's what gardening was. I didn't really know enough about this other form of gardening until I started to learn about regenerative agriculture and then started to apply these techniques to my own home gardening. I actually didn't even garden before that because I wasn't that interested in it. Because I'm like, you have to rent this big machine and you're just tilling up all this soil, and then you have to weed everything and you water all the time and everything's in a straight row. It just seemed like a lot of work for some payoff, right? But not as much abundance as I get in my garden now with very minimal work. So I know a lot of people in their head think of a garden and they think of straight lines with bare soil, no weeds, and everything's perfect. And I think something Manon and I want to do with 5D Resilience Gardens and just our work in general is change the paradigm and change the way that we view the world and think about the ways that the whole ecosystem interacts with itself. So regenerative gardeners actually don't like bare ground, as we talked about a little bit earlier. So we have some techniques that we use to address how do you go from this big tilled rectangular plot with no weeds and bare ground, and then to the type of garden production that you can see in our photos that both Manon and I have in our own homes. And Manon mentioned a little bit about broad forking. I think, Kristen, you're a pretty big fan of broad forking. Do I remember that correctly?
Yes, I am. Partly because I love worms. And if you rototill, you chop up the worms, and no, they don't make more worms from each segment. You just kill the worms. And so I didn't want to do that. And I used to hand dig my garden with a fork. But I've got a little age on me, and doing that is a lot of work for me. And so I was looking at alternatives, and broad fork, which is my particular one, is, I don't know, it's probably 18 inches wide. And then the tines are probably, I think they're about 12 inches long. And you basically, sort of thrust and then step on the thing that holds the tines, and then you lean back and it lifts the soil, and then you basically drag the broad fork towards you a little bit, put it in again, step on it, lean back, it lifts the soil, and you just do that over and over again. And like these folks were talking about, I actually would have to be in the garden bed at that point, but I use a piece of plywood, so I'm always standing on the plywood, so it just disperses my weight over a broad area. So yeah, so I broad fork usually in the fall. That's when I put compost or whatever I'm going to put in the fall, and it aerates the soil in the fall, and then the soil just sort of works in the wintertime, and then I do some light forking in the spring.
Thank you for sharing that. And my mind says, let's make a video of it this fall so people can see it. Because I think seeing it really helps you understand, especially if you've never done it before. I don't know of anyone locally that sells broad forks, unfortunately. I think some of the greenhouse nursery garden centers in Boise have it, and you can order them online. They are relatively expensive, but if you take good care of the handles, usually they're wood, sometimes they're metal. If they're wood, just take care of them, keep them sanded, keep them oiled so that it lasts for your whole life. You'll probably never have to buy a broad fork again when you make the investment the first time.
And I'm sure if anyone wants to see a video, you can do a search on YouTube. There probably are many videos available on YouTube about broad forking, how to do it.
Somebody just wrote that you can get a broad fork from a farmer supply store. Thank you, Jan.
Right.
Go
the only thing I would comment is that you can put a lot of, I have a heavy clay soil, and you can put a lot of torque on the handles of that broad fork. So I've bought a broad fork for the botanical garden from Johnny's, and I bought an all metal broad fork for myself from, I think, a company called Meadow Creatures. And I found that the handles of the Johnny's broad fork were kind of flimsy. So just so know before you go, watching those videos and thinking about what your soil's like will probably be really helpful when you shop.
Very important tips. Thank you for sharing those. Another technique I just wanted to mention, and we see this a lot in larger scale agriculture, is strip tilling. So instead of tilling up the entire field, you have a special strip tiller that only tills the exact area that you're going to plant. And usually on a large scale farm, you're following that immediately with a drill where you're planting the seeds. But the strip tilling, you can do that in your garden, where if you have a garden plan or know a general area where you want to plant plants, you can dig up that spot a little bit and then leave all the undisturbed soil around it. So that's one way of kind of going in between no-till and just full-on rototiller tillage. And I think Kristen's point of doing some of this work in the fall is really nice, because in the spring, like maybe not so much this spring, but in springs past, it's really moist. And when the soil is wet, it's really, we should try to limit how much we mess with it and disturb it. So if we can get our compost or manure or organic matter in the fall and broad fork it then it's ready to plant in the spring, and we're not doing all the walking on our garden beds when that soil is precious and filled with water, because we want all that water to stay there, but we don't want the compaction to happen.
But in the spring, if you have to do it in the spring, you don't do it just after it rained. You have to let the moisture drain out some to work any clay. You don't want it to be dry. If it's dry, it's like a rock. You can't work it. And if it's too wet, it doesn't work either. It's like slush, and it'll just compact it more. So you have to wait till, if you have a clayish soil, you have to wait till you just have the right amount of moisture to work it. And
anything else you want to talk about with tillage, or should we talk about chemical use?
I actually wanted to go back about mulching. On the photo, we prepared these beds to plant, and we'll be planting beginning of June. So we prepared the beds, and then they're dormant until, or they're actually growing their microbial population right now after we've added more compost to the soil. So we covered them for that reason. But once we plant, then we remove the mulch only in the areas that we're planting. And just know that if you have organic mulch, which is decaying matter, right? You have, if you use wood chips or plant material, dead weeds or stems of other plants, they're slowly decaying into a compost, into humus eventually. But you don't want that decaying material to be in contact with the plants you're growing. So if you're growing, say you're planting kale in your bed, you have to toss your mulch aside and make sure that the mulch is at least 2-3 inches away from the stems of the plants, that the plant is not touching the decaying material, because you don't want that all the decaying, the organisms that actually create the decaying, you don't want them to attack your plants. You want your plant to grow, not to decay. So you don't want to have them in contact.
Mm-hmm.
Say, before we move on, we were talking about cover crops, or you guys were talking about cover crops. How about legumes or vetch or clover to break up hardpan or to add nitrogen into the soil?
Definitely for nitrogen fixation. All the legumes, whether it's alfalfa or clover or garden peas, or there's Austrian winter peas is a pretty common one you see, dry beans, pole beans, anything in the legume family definitely fixes nitrogen. It is oh gosh, now I'm testing my pronunciation and memory. I think it's rhizobia. It's a specific type of microbe that actually does the nitrogen fixation. So if you don't, and it's hard to know if that's active, there's ways that you can look. The legume roots actually have these little nodules on them. If those are white, you might not have the active rhizobial activity. If they're yellow, that's usually the sign that they're active. There are inoculants that you can purchase for it, but really the best way is boosting your soil fertility across the board will bring those naturally in there. But sometimes you can buy the legume seeds that already are inoculated. That's one way to do it. I know Manon and I, we really don't like to tell people to go buy stuff. We like to come up with ways to do it on your own. So one way to inoculate with this rhizobia might be to make a farmer friend who uses these techniques on their own and dig up a little bit of their soil that's already inoculated and just use that. And you can treat the seeds with it ahead of time, which would just be like dunking your pea seeds into a little slurry, a little wet mixture, and then planting it. You could also, after you seeded or before you seeded, you could take a mixture of that soil mixed with water and just apply it to your land. That would be what I would do personally. Whether or not they help to break up compacted soil, I mean, I think anything that has a ton of fibrous roots is going to help break up soil. And we'll talk a little.
Plants that have tap roots, long tap roots, like comfrey, or any plant that has long tap roots, including all the weeds.
Yeah, burdock is a beautiful deep tap root, and I like to think weeds show up in places that need like. Weeds are attracted to soil that needs the benefits that the weeds bring in. So if you have a lot of burdock in your garden, it's probably a sign that you have compacted soil. And that soil, dandelion root is another deep tap-rooted plant. When those weeds appear in areas, they're serving a purpose. The best thing that we can do is let those weeds live out their life cycle and feed that soil and turn that soil in. And I would put money on the fact that if you did that for a couple of years, those weeds wouldn't show up anymore because they've served their purpose and they are moving on to go rehabilitate and steward the next spot of land that needs that decompaction.
Another way is to use plant potatoes. Potatoes is a good crop to grow in first time soil, and it helps to break up the soil. And anything you do that adds organic matter to your soil will increase your population of worms, and your worms will decompact the soil.
Yeah, ants, I think that's another one.
Ants,
that
yeah.
They're more found in sandy soil than clay-like soil. But when you see ants in a certain part of your yard or garden, they're serving a purpose. Not only are they aerating with all their little ant tubes, they're also taking food, right? And maybe that's like your watermelon that you left out from your barbecue last night, or maybe that's old plant material. They're taking that into the soil, and that's turning into organic matter. So make friends with your bugs in your garden. I know for me, when I started gardening, I was like, oh, what are all these ants doing? They're such a nuisance. Oh, how do I get rid of them? And then I was like, let me take a step back and think about this. Like, what is the ant's purpose? Like, what niche are they filling in my garden? And it became obvious to me that they're going where I have low organic matter and compacted sandy soil, and they're doing their thing. And as I started to build soil health, the ants went from being all over my garden to being edged out to the margins, right? And the more soil health I build and the bigger my garden expanded, the more those ants were pushed out. They got to a point where the only place they were in between my pavers, where we actually put sand down. And that's where the ants were, which was not fun, because that's obviously where you walk. And some of the ants that are in our region can bite. The red ants will nibble, and they don't feel great. But it's a sign. It's a sign that your soil might be a little bit compacted or a little bit sandy and lacking organic matter. That answer the question, Kristen?
Yes, I think so. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about it. It makes me happy to talk about those types of things and listening to the bugs and the plants and what they're telling us. It's an important communication and relationship to build. So the part that's always hard for some people to hear is the part about chemicals and synthetic pesticides and fertilizers alike. They disturb the soil. They hurt the microbiome. I think one thing that a lot of people may not be aware of, I'm sure everyone's aware of glyphosate or Roundup as you buy it commercially. Not only is it a pesticide, it's an antibiotic. So antibiotic literally means anti-life. So it will kill everything, including all those biomes that you're working so hard to have in your soil, all those worms, all those good things, all the bees. It kills. And it is water soluble, which means it washes away with water, which means it washes down into your subsoils, into the rocks, into the aquifer. And there's a lot of other chemicals that people use in their gardens. And Manon and I are both very much committed to no chemical usage at all. But if you do decide to use chemicals, try to find ones that are specific to what you're trying to address, not the broad scope ones like glyphosate, because they literally kill almost everything they touch. So if you really have a problem with a certain weed, and you know there's a chemical that works on that certain weed, go that route. Because when you use something like glyphosate on a weed that it really doesn't, like bindweed is a perfect example. Glyphosate doesn't kill bindweed. And when we use glyphosate on bindweed, we're actually creating more herbicide resistant bindweed, because the bindweed still reproduces. It still spreads out. It's just getting used to the toxin, which makes it an even bigger problem, especially for our farmers in the region. So that's my soapbox about chemicals. Manon, what's yours?
I would say even, when I took my master gardener's training, they talked about integrated pest management and how we should use mechanical traps first as our first resource to deal with bugs and pests, and then go to biological techniques, and even using those biological techniques, or using something called safer soap, which is organic, right? Well, it's organic, but it's concentrated, and it still acts as a something that disturbs the soil. Even soap, if you use just dish soap or Dr. Brenner's soap, or any soap to get the aphids away. If you have soap in your soil, it leaches out things. You put soap in your dishwasher so that it cleans everything off your plate. Well, it will also leach the good things off the soil. Your fertile soil is going to leach out all its good things, the minerals, and the microorganisms will be affected too. So even if it's something that is in between quotes organic, only use those things, whether it's chemical, synthetic, or organic. Only use it locally. If you use it, don't spread it broadly. Only use it on a specific very an exact location, an exact plant. And just be aware that anything you put in the soil that is not organic, that is not a food for your soil, for your biology, disturbs your soil. So we have to think twice.
Yeah. And I just add to that, I really appreciate you bringing in the organic thing, because I think a lot of times we say, oh, well, if it's organic, it's fine. And I think diatomaceous earth is one that I think about a lot. It's not related so much to soil health, but of course it has its repercussions for soil health, because diatomaceous earth, if you're not familiar with it, is an organic pest control substance that's used, and it essentially cuts up the exoskeleton of the bug. But it affects every bug. So if you're using it to get rid of aphids or spider mites or ants, it's also going to get on the bees and the worms and the beetles and all the stuff you like. Like diatomaceous earth doesn't discriminate against the different bug that you want. So we talked about it in our soil, or in our pollinator webinar that we did last month. So if you're really interested in that, I recommend checking that out. Ecological pest management is the route that I take. And I think we have some great people in our community, in our University of Idaho extension, that will speak to this more eloquently than I will. But essentially, when you kill off the aphids, you're killing the food for the beneficial insects. And ladybugs don't reproduce as fast as aphids do. So if you kill off all the food for the beneficials, you're killing off the beneficials, and then the pest comes back and there's no beneficials to go munch on and reduce the population. So we really have to think holistically and long-term about the implications of the choices that we make in our garden. Even though we really want to get rid of those aphids, there's better ways to manage them than attacking them with an organic or synthetic pesticide. Good on that, Manon? Ready to move on to water? Okay. Smart water use. Why don't you just go with it, Manon? You're definitely more of an expert in it than I am.
Okay. So irrigation techniques, the idea about smart water use is to only water when the area you needs to be watered. Only water when your plant needs water. Overwatering is actually not good for your plant. Overwatering the soil leaches out the nutrients from the soil, and it removes space for the oxygen. If your soil is full of water, there is no pocket of oxygen left, and the fertile soil, the microorganisms, the microbes in the soil need oxygen to live. So overwatering is not good. Underwatering is not good either, as it starves the microorganisms and they might die. So you just need the right amount of water. And the other thing to consider is only deliver the water where you need it. If you have a plant, deliver the water to that plant. And we do that. We can do that with a drip system. But the indigenous people, the indigenous cultures, for a long time only used hand delivered water, or they use strings and let the drop go down the string, to what it, or use a little tube and put the water in the tube that goes directly to the root, or they use oyas, which is, it's an earthware container that seeps, the water can seep out of it slowly. So they filled that container with water. That container is actually buried with the opening near the surface of the soil. And then you fill that container, and then the water slowly seeps out, and the water is delivered at the level where the roots are. So when you water, you have to consider where the roots of your plants are and make sure that you water at that level. So if you're watering really fast, like if you dump a lot of water all at once, the water will tend to just go through and go deep, unless it's very clayish and your soil is not draining. But if your soil is draining well, which all garden beds should be, to be healthy, you don't want to deliver water fast. So it's better to use drip systems that deliver the water slowly. And when the water is delivered slowly, the water spreads horizontally before it goes down into the earth. So knowing the depth of your root system, obviously a tree has deeper roots. So when we have a drip system around trees or shrubs, their roots are deeper than typically your vegetables. The roots are, within 4, 5, 6, 8 inches, or maybe a little more if you're growing root vegetables. So you have to be conscious of how deep you want to water and test it. And one way to test if you're watering too much or not enough is you can meter. There's little meters you can use that you stick in the soil at the depth of the roots. And another way is to plant something like comfrey. Comfrey is a plant that will go limp if it doesn't have enough water. So if you have comfrey here and there in your garden, and your comfrey is happy and it's sticking up and it's happy, you have enough water in your soil. And if you see that your comfrey is getting limp, oh, you don't have enough water in your soil. So there are plants that are used as markers, or look at the plants you're growing themselves, like a tomato plant. Wait till your tomato plant starts to go a little limp before you water it. If you listen to the plant will tell you. So you can use hand watering if you have a small garden and time and patience. But here, since at times we have to water every day, and a lot of people are on the go and are not there every day to water. So having a drip system on a timer is really helpful. So here we have 2 systems shown. The top image shows a soaker hose laid out. So it's like, going back and forth on top of the garden. And the bottom image is the Netafim drip system. And that has a little drip hole every foot. And you put each, you put your lines 1 foot apart from each other. So typically we have 3 lines in a garden bed to cover the width of the garden bed. And in a garden, you can use a drip rate of 0.4 gallons per minute. No, gallons per hour. So each drip is 0.4 gallon per hour in the garden. And so that's for vegetables that have typical, shallow roots. And if you want to go deeper for shrubs, you might use a 0.6 gallons per hour. And for your trees, then you can go to the regular 1 gallon per hour. But know that landscapers are not always aware of this. So it's good to be aware and to tell them what you want. And we have a really good store here in Haley, Silver Creek Plumbing, and they sell these pipes, and you can go to the counter, and they're very helpful and very patient, and they will explain to you, you know, all the different systems and how it works and how to put it together.
And so I'll share another story about my gardening learning experience. So when I first put in my garden in Haley, this soaker hose picture is my garden on the 4th year of gardening. And before all this happened, I decided my first year I was just going to buy all these different plants that were pretty and cool and put them in. So I have, you know, some perennial flowers, some herbs, carrots, lettuce, all in the same thing. And I thought, that's not going to be a problem. It's going to be great. Well, they all over time need different amounts of water. So if I watered enough to germinate carrots, I was overwatering this amazing, beautiful flowering plant, perennial plant that I had. So if you're starting a new garden, try to be thoughtful about plantings where you're planting the plants that need similar water use in the similar area. And you might think about a transition like, okay, maybe you want perennials in this garden bed, and the first year they need more water to establish. And that's the same year that you're going to grow some vegetables mixed in. And then you might transition in a couple years and not have vegetables in there, most likely because your perennials are going to fill in and take up a lot of space. But it's important to think through that, because you're wasting water if you are watering the same rates to plants that don't need water or that do need water. So things like aspen usually take a little bit more water than some of even the flowering fruiting trees. So maybe think about not having those in the same area, or having the aspen in the same area where you have some columbine or some other plants that might need a little bit more water and a little bit more shade than some of the xeriscaped, drought-friendly varieties of native plantings if you're going in a native planting direction. And I think it's also important to maybe just talk a little bit about dryland techniques. I think it's going to become more important as we get more and more drought stricken in the West. There's a lot of people in the agricultural space that are looking at dryland techniques, which is basically only using the water that falls from the sky. And you can incorporate that a little differently into your garden, where maybe you're watering less often. I know the drought-friendly lawn program that Kristen hosted with Ryan Santo from the Wood River Land Trust. He talked a lot about like less water, deeper water, like longer time in between watering and deeper watering when you do water. And that's going to let your roots sink down into the ground and access the water that's already there. And that's a really interesting way of incorporating dryland farming. There are some like wine producers that use dryland farming, and they say that the fruit is actually more tasty and flavorful because it is a little bit stressed out. So plants, when they're stressed out, actually sometimes create more nutrients. So it's just something to think about. You don't have to baby them, especially when you are a seed saver like Manon and I are. Letting the plants adapt as close to the natural habitat as possible leads to bioregionally adapted cultivars, which leads to more resilient planting in the long term. If I'm growing carrots and I'm babying them and all the weeds are picked out and they're getting all the water all the time, those seeds are going to require the same thing to grow next season. Where if they get a little stressed out and there's some weeds in there and they get dried out every once in a while and they're still productive and healthy plants, those seeds are going to be more resilient in the long run. So that's all I have to say about it.
In the dry land, and then I want to go back to irrigation, but in the dry land technique, people plant deeper to access the moisture in the soil. For example, the Hopis will plant corn 1 foot deep in the soil, and they'll wait for the rain to come, and they don't water. It's just the rain will come at some point. The water will seep into the soil, and they put their corn deep, and they put their corn far away from each other. Like it might be like 3 feet away from each other, 1 ear of corn every 3 feet in a special pattern they plant. And because 1 foot deep, it will take a long time for the soil to dry 1 foot deep. The soil, the moisture will be retained, and that's, so the corn accesses that deep water. It's amazing that they can do that. But about irrigation, we can build in some flexibility in our drip system, in our irrigation systems in different ways. One way is I have one zone for my gardens, and I do have a mix of plants in my gardens, perennials and different plants. But so what I do is I water minimally for most of the plants, and then I'll go water by hand in some areas at some times. So I don't water too much on my sprinkler system, but I'll go check my plants every few days and add water manually if I have to, only in the areas that I need. Another way that I manage that is I have a lot of valves, so I can turn off or on a valve in a zone. So I have my garden zone, but within that I have a lot of valves that I can turn off. If an area is not planted yet, I turn the valve off. If the crop is done or it's close to be done and it's better not to water before I harvest, I turn that off. So I have all these little valves here and there that can be turned on and off within a zone, which helps. And these little valves, they're plastic little valves, and they're not expensive. And you can put them in yourself. Another way also, I do a lot of container gardening. So I have these big pots and barrels, and I grow all my herbs in these pots, and I have a tiny 1/4 inch drip line that goes from pot to pot. And from year to year, I don't have the same configuration of these pots. So every fall I remove that drip line, and every spring I reinstall it. And so I've learned, about the technology and how to put them together and all the parts that I need. And when I have a question, I go to Silver Creek, and they're so kind, and they answer all my questions, and they've helped me so much. But I took charge of, putting together my own drip system in my garden beds. I learned how to do it. I asked my landscaper to provide me with a riser where I can plug in my pipes, and I have a cap on it during the winter, and in the spring I remove the cap and I add my little system, and I change it, modify it as I need to. And it takes knowledge, and it takes a little time, but it really pays off. And it's so satisfying to know that I'm in charge, that I know how to do it, and that I don't have to, call my landscaper every time I want to change a little drip pot in one section.
So I think that segues us nicely into a couple upcoming things that we wanted to feature. Manon, will you just talk about the hands-on drip irrigation demo that you're willing to host for people who want to learn how to install this?
Yes, we're about to install the drip system in the community garden at the Grange. So this year we have a different configuration. So I unplugged the drip we had last year, and we have to redo the drip system in there. So I'm inviting anyone who wants to learn about the Netafim drip system and how to put it together, including the pressure regulator and the splitter and the timer and the zone splitter and all the little connectors and the tubes that don't have a hole in them that runs, from the water pipe to the zone where I want to water. And then from there you have the drip tubes. So anyone who wants hands-on experience installing a drip and learning about that, so they can do it by themselves at home, I'm inviting anyone to let me know, and we'll set a time that's convenient to whoever is interested, and we can go do it together. It would be within the next 10 days, I would say.
And you can come tell us what time would work for you at our Seed and Plant Exchange this Saturday from 10 a.m. to noon. It's going to be a fun time. We're hoping for maybe a little less rainy weather than our Earth Day event, which was still beautiful, but a little rainy, a little cold. We will have the Wood River Seed Library will have seeds available as well as some plant starts. We do an exchange, so there's no financial requirement, but if you have things to exchange, we invite you to do that. And if you feel weird about not bringing anything to exchange, we will accept donations for our ongoing work in the Grange Garden and Seed Library. And we will have, I think, 3 farms, Itty Bitty, Squash Blossom, and Lookout Farm will all be selling their plant starts. So if you want to shop for plant starts, it's a great place to get those.
And some of them will also have produce.
Oh,
some of them have said that they have an abundance of early produce, so they may show up with some produce as well as their plant starts. And we're so excited that they're doing plant starts. We used to have plant starts available locally through King's store, which sold. But I say locally, the plants did not really all, they weren't necessarily grown locally, but they were available locally. But now we have these farmers growing plants adapted to our climate, and they're doing them right here on their farm locally. And that's so amazing that we got there. 15 years ago, we did not have that. And now we have these 3 relatively young farmers who have responded to the demand of local gardeners wanting starts from the local varieties and from different varieties than the typical varieties that are sold at the grocery store. So they have the diversity of varieties, and some of these farmers have risked their shirt, literally, getting into farming as young farmers, and I hope we can show up and really support them.
And Squash Blossom did get the contract for their annual vegetable starts at Sun Valley Garden Center. So if you can't make it to the exchange, you are welcome to shop for their plant starts at Sun Valley Garden Center at the north end of Bellevue. And another great way to support our local farmers is go to the brand new Saturday market happening in Haley starting on June 12th. It'll be every Saturday from June 12th to, I think, either the last week of October or first week of September, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m.
End of September.
At the Roberta McKercher Park, but it will be at the space, I think, in between the highway and the RV dump station. Is that correct, Manon?
Yeah, it's along the highway.
So you should see
there's a little grass strip between the highway and where the RV can come. And so it'll be there, and it may be actually on both sides of that little RV space.
And we really want it to be successful, so we keep a weekend market in Haley. So please show up if you like supporting our local farmers. And Manon and I will be there on opening day with seeds and plants available for exchange as well. So we hope to see you at one of our upcoming events or booths at the Haley Farmers Market.
Well, and I notice in the chat that someone's already said they wanted to learn about drip irrigation. And so I will be sending out contact information when I send out the link to the video from this talk. I'll also send out contact information for you guys.
Wonderful. Thank you. And just a last little blurb of ways that you can engage with us. We have a Facebook group called 5B Resilience Gardens. It is a private group, so it's only people that request that are local that can join in. That's a way to ask questions, exchange plants. If you're looking for something in particular, I'm on there. We have a couple other admin that are helping manage that. So please join us there. You can go to 5bresiliencegardens.org and get links to all this stuff. You can email us, gardens@sunvalleyinstitute.org. And if you want to be a 5B resilience gardener and join the collaboration, we have a form you can fill out to express what you're interested in, and that there's a URL there, but I don't think you can click through from your screen. So yes, Jan is taking a photo of it. Good thinking. It's also on 5bresiliencegarden.org, where you can get that direct link to the Google form. So with that, I know we don't have a ton of time, but I'll stop sharing my screen. And if we've got a little bit of time for conversations, questions, Manon and I love just talking about all the stuff. So
one quick question, that last screen that had the 4 links to it, can you just copy that and paste it to me, and I'll send that out with the resources?
Absolutely. Would it be helpful if I put it in the chat right now?
I'm sure that's helpful for some people. It's never helpful for me, because then it's like, well, what do I do with it? But for some people it might be. So
having the email would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
I didn't copy that pretty, but I think you'll get at least a little bit of it and can grab the email from it.
Okay.
And I'll make sure I get it over to Kristen too, so she can include it.
That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we do have a little bit of time left. Any specific questions that you have for these 2 experts? Oh yeah, Jan, go ahead.
I've been wondering if
I'm going to put us on gallery view. So
yeah, I've been wondering if I could go down to the rock quarry that's south of Bellevue and see if they have rock dust to put on the garden. Do you know?
I don't know, but it's a waste product of gravel mining. So I bet they would be very happy to hear from you. So I say go for it. You could call them ahead of time if you want to. I don't know if there's an office there that people are managing, if it's on site or somewhere else. If you do it, let us know, because rock dust is a great way to add minerals to your garden.
That's what I was thinking. The other thing that I'm really curious about is biochar, how to use it, how to inoculate it, etc.
Yeah, so biochar, for those who don't know, is a way of burning organic matter. It's at a certain temperature where you don't turn it into ash, but you basically turn it into activated charcoal. And biochar has a lot of surface area, so it's a really good host to the microbiome of the soil. So that's one of the main things that people use it for. I don't know of anyone locally who's making it, but there are, if you just YouTube biochar rocket stoves, you might be able to make your own out of like a big barrel. You should be very safe with that in a drought season. Maybe get permission from the fire department before you start one of those. I don't think you could do it in the city of Haley because there's some limitations about burning things. But essentially biochar is a technique that people are using. It's becoming more popular these days, and it's a really nice way to add organic matter and that microbial habitat in your garden.
There are recipes. If you do a search online, there are different recipes on how to make it, how to inoculate it.
I bought some, and I haven't had the courage to inoculate it and put it in the yard.
Well, if you have any compost, you can make compost tea. If you have any yogurt or kefir, you can dilute that and use that as an inoculant.
You could ask me or Manon to come to our gardens and dig up a little shovelful and mix that in with water and dump your biochar in that.
Okay.
You can also go out into nature, and anywhere, you don't want to dig a lot, obviously, because we have relatively fragile ecosystems here. But if you're in a forested area and you see really vibrant, healthy looking plants, take a little handful of soil. And if you go around and do that from a handful of places, you'll be inoculating your own garden with the microbiome of our ecosystem. And those types of inoculants are
very much.
No. Just a tiny bit. Worm castings are also another great inoculant. So if you have a little worm poop juice, you could throw that in with some biochar.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's basically
exciting.
a fermentation process, right? The same way you ferment fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, I heard
It's a
that I can put
fermentation
rice bran in there and also a little bit of blackstrap molasses.
Yeah.
Mhm.
to feed
Honey, milk, anything with a little bit of sugar is going to work really nicely.
Okay.
Blackstrap molasses is great because it has a lot of nutrients already in it. I
Right.
think some people just want to prefer the local stuff. So honey or milk would be your best option if you want to do a place-based, locally sourced inoculant with sugar in it. But maple syrup would work too. Sugar water.
Sauerkraut.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Kombucha, kefir.
Fermented beets.
Yeah, lots of things. Can inoculate with all sorts of things.
We have to get creative and take our power back and, you know, think like a homesteader. And there's so many things we can do on our own. We don't have to always buy things from the industry. They're not necessarily the best things. They're easier because you just buy it. But how about learning about fermentation? Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that could be an
Multiplying
upcoming class.
microorganisms.
Well, I think we've just about run out of time. Thanks for that great question, Jan. So I just want to thank you, Manon, and thank you, Amy, for a wonderful series and kind of knocking it out of the park with this last one. So thank you very much. And yes, a virtual applause for you both. And
Thank you for hosting us.
Yeah, Kristen, you've done such an incredible job putting together resources for our community, and I love being a part of these. So I look forward to doing another round, maybe this fall or winter. And I'll plug again, go to the website and watch our previous ones if you haven't tuned in, and the other ones too. You had a lot of great presenters over the winter and spring. So I've attended a lot and have a list of ones that I didn't make it to in person that I'm going to watch on a rainy day.
Well, thank you for the plug. I really appreciate it. And thank you both again very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
And happy gardening.